Cynthia Zink with New Hampshire Citizens Alliance and the community organizer there. For those of you who don't know, New Hampshire Citizens Alliance is a 30-year-old nonprofit organization fighting for social and economic justice. And so I have a pleasure tonight to introduce a really great panel. Krista Rant, who is a mother in Suncook, New Hampshire, and we'll talk about her experience struggling with unemployment. And Jeff McLynch is the Executive Director of New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, which is an organization that works on our state budget. And so we're always looking to Jeff's expertise and research around what's happening on the state budget. And Cynthia Ward, who's here from U.S. Action, to talk about some of the campaigns that are happening nationally. And Cynthia previously was the Executive Director of Northeast Action, so she's sort of local, an hour away. I'll just let Krista begin. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Krista. My education is as a civil engineer. I am currently working in retail and doing some odd jobs, but prior to this, I had a job, at least partly, because of the availability of funding due to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So I'd like to make the case that job funding and civil works funding in particular can make a huge difference for the unemployed in this country. Using my case as a specific example, because certainly I know my own situation best. So my family is made up of my husband Lee and my daughter Anna, who's 5. Lee's a civil engineer as well, went to the University of Maine. He has an undergraduate degree. I have a master's. He's gone on to work in transportation engineering at the Department of Transportation in New Hampshire, and I focused on environmental and water resources. So we both felt that civil engineering was our commitment to the future, our commitment to our country, and we're really excited about getting involved in our fields. We graduated right into the recession, him in 2009, me in 2010. We found work. It was difficult, but it was possible, partly because of the funding from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. At the DOT, people were ready to hit the ground running. There were all these shovel-ready projects you might have heard about at that time. They needed engineers desperately, so he was one of the new ones they brought on board. I graduated a little while later. After calling the number on every business card I'd collected in graduate school, I finally found a position at a small consulting firm. I worked on projects called brownfields remediation, where these sites, not quite as yucky as the Superfund sites you've heard of, but sites that were nonetheless too contaminated to use by the community, had lain dormant sometimes for decades. And finally, the money to clean those sites up were available because of the ARA funding. So that was a great part of what I did for work while I was there. As that funding started to dry up, which it did, the situation deteriorated for both my husband and I at work. Things were tense at the state as the legislature began asking for cuts, and people were losing their jobs all over the state, including at the DOT. Thankfully, his job was spared. However, there were also layoffs at my firm as our projects ended, and the current workforce was reduced to 2/3 of what it was originally. As a young new hire, I was one of the ones out the door. And those projects were still out there. You know, we had really made some difference at some brownfields, but there were still many more. Some bridges had been repaired, some roads had been repaired, but there were plenty more left to do. The American Society of Civil Engineers has rated our overall infrastructure at something like a D in this country. And water infrastructure, which is where it's really my specialty and where I was hoping to move next to, that's rated at an F. We have failing infrastructure. We have out of work young civil engineers. I see a solution here. In engineering, we always talk about how there are a number of solutions to any given project, any given problem. So one of those options is always the do nothing option. Let things rest as they are, retain the status quo. Well, what happens if we do do nothing? Well, young families like my own flounder economically and professionally. Certainly not supporting my family at the level I had hoped to. Still have a roof over our heads, thankfully. Still, making rent and getting groceries, but it's not really the picture we painted for ourselves because, of course, young folks like ourselves, we bought into the American dream, which meant that we took out student loans in order to try to invest in ourselves so that we could bring our talents to the future. We really did take stock in that idea that a college education was important, essential, and I took pride in that education, but I've got money to pay back, so our family's not doing as well as it could be. Other costs of the do-nothing option. Well, without another end to my profession, and I am still looking for work, I can't get my professional licensure. Civil engineers need to work under another engineer for a couple of years before they're full-fledged. I can't realize my ideas about the future on my own. I need to work with another civil engineer for a while. So right now I'm kind of putting odds and ends together while I search for that next job. Another cost of the do-nothing option, this isn't personal, but it's larger than that. This affects our community, our state, our nation. Our infrastructure continues to fall into disrepair. Like I said, those projects are still out there. They're critical ones. Can you imagine as bridges close, economic efficiencies are introduced, as trucking and commuters are rerouted? You may remember a bridge even falling down a couple years ago in the Midwest. That's a problem. You can imagine water mains starting to get leaks or even failing catastrophically. This has happened too. This results in costly emergency repairs, sometimes acute supply problems. It's an issue when you turn your faucet on and the water you're expecting doesn't come out anymore. So those are the costs of the do-nothing option. Anything is better than the do-nothing option, I think. If we put some funding into these areas, we have some better options. We can fund repairs to our infrastructure before it's too late to preserve those infrastructure resources that we have. Emergency repairs and winging it through retrofits are expensive, inefficient, and they're often inadequate. We don't need to go through a slapdash repair process here. We need to reimagine the infrastructure that we have for a different economy, climate, energy situation, different demographics and needs than in the century, and it often has been a half century or so since these were first designed. It's a different world. A better option is taking the opportunity to fund projects like this so highly trained, motivated young people can solve the problems and meet the challenges that we're now presented with. That's my argument for why it's important to fund jobs, and in particular why I think civil works projects are essential. Also, I'm looking for work, as you just heard. If anyone knows of a civil engineering firm that I should get in touch with, please let me know. Move on to Jeff.
Thank you. Well, as Olivia mentioned, my name is Jeff McLynch. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. We're a small nonprofit that's located in Concord, and we do a lot of work on the state budget and the state's tax system and how that affects low and middle income people here in New Hampshire. And what I've been asked to talk tonight about are some of the consequences that federal tax debates could have on New Hampshire's budget here at home. And so what I thought I'd try to do in the time that we have tonight is really try to focus on sort of answering four questions. First of all, what are the Bush tax cuts? We hear a lot of discussion about it, just thought it's worth reviewing what we mean when we say those things. Secondly, look at sort of two of the real defining characteristics of those tax cuts, who tends to benefit from them, and secondly, what impact they have on the federal budget picture. And then lastly, wrap up with a look at sort of, well, if there are consequences for the federal budget, how might those get passed along to New Hampshire? So I'm sure everybody's really eager to get raring here, so we'll just jump right in. When this past week, there was a debate in Congress about tax policy, and it really sort of focused on 3 areas. The first are the extension of what are typically known as the Bush tax cuts. As you may remember, when President Bush took office, he immediately pushed through legislation in 2001, and that legislation was built upon in 2003. And that really focused on changes in the overall rate structure for just regular income, your salary and wages, lower those rates throughout the rate structure. And then secondly, adopted a number of tax cuts for so-called unearned income, or things like capital gains, the income you get from investing in stocks and bonds and dividends. Now, we also saw some changes in the child tax credit, making that a little bit more generous. As it was originally enacted, those Bush tax cuts included, over time, the total elimination of the estate tax. That's since changed when the Bush tax cuts were initially extended back in 2010. The estate tax wasn't completely eliminated. There is still one in place. It's much more modest than it used to be, and so there's a lot of discussion about how that should be going forward, whether to revert to old law, where you had about a $2 million exemption, or do as the president suggested with a $7 million exemption, or follow the course that congressional Republicans have put forward and take that exemption up to $10 million. Lastly, there are a set of changes that were enacted in 2009 dealing with tax credits for low-income folks. So an expansion of the earned income tax credit for people with 3 or more kids, as well as making the child tax credit more targeted. So when you take those all together, what does it look like? Well, by and large, the Bush tax cuts are heavily skewed towards people at the very top of the income distribution. These numbers that you see up here, hopefully I'm not blocking them too badly, looks at New Hampshire residents paying federal taxes as projected in 2013. And what you see is that for people at the very top of the income distribution, the wealthiest 1% of New Hampshire taxpayers, if the Bush tax cuts were extended into 2013, they would, on average, receive a tax cut of $83,750. Obviously, that's more than many New Hampshire residents make in any given year. That would be their tax reduction. If you contrast that with people at the middle of the income distribution, they would see an average tax cut of just under $1,000 under an extension of the Bush tax cuts. So it's a pretty stark contrast. One other way to think about it is to look at the total tax cut that could get enacted and think about what share goes to that richest 1%. Well, the latest numbers suggest that they would get over 30% of that total tax cut. So again, very skewed towards the top of the income distribution in New Hampshire. The second characteristic I want to focus on is sort of the role that the Bush tax cuts have played and will play going forward in the nation's overall fiscal outlook. This graph, a little bit on the complicated side, I'll admit, is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And what they did is they looked at, going forward, what's the annual budget deficit going to look like? And basically what they find is that by 2019, it could be about $1.2 trillion per year. And they tried to figure out, well, what drives that budget deficit? What would make it that size? And what they find is that the economic downturn obviously makes a contribution. Some of the remnants of TARP contribute as well. There's still ongoing costs from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but really the driving force behind that would be the Bush tax cuts if they were enacted. Of that $1.2 trillion deficit roughly, over $600 to $700 million would be attributable to the Bush tax cuts alone. So if, for instance, the economic picture improves, that bottom blue part may shrink a little bit and the overall outlook might change. But again, it's really the Bush tax cuts that are pushing that. Just to give you an idea, sort of on a one-year time frame, the debate that occurred in the Senate last week had the proposal to extend the Bush tax cuts been adopted, that would have meant a revenue loss of over $300 billion in fiscal 13 alone. That contrasts with the plan that the president has put forward, which would limit those tax cuts to the first $250,000 of income. It's about $68 billion per year less in terms of total revenue lost. So what I want to focus on, what we have left, is sort of the chain that connects these Bush tax cuts to the New Hampshire budget. And obviously, if we're facing budget deficits of trillions of dollars per year, and there's great concern about the federal debt, folks want to know, well, how are you going to get that under control? And really, it can be done through additional revenue, through spending cuts, or some combination of the two. And if there are going to be spending cuts, they're likely to fall on a pretty limited portion of the overall federal budget. My apologies for the small font here, but these are numbers from the National Priorities Project, and they sort of break down what the federal budget really consists of. And that big blue portion of the pie chart over there is mandatory spending, things like Social Security or Medicare. That's about just under 2/3 of the overall expenditures in 2013, at least proposed by the president. The green pie piece there is interest spending, so that too is hard to cut. We don't want to default on our debt obligations. So that leaves so-called discretionary spending. And within that discretionary spending, you've got the military. That's usually considered hands-off, although that, under the current sequestration, there are going to be some cuts made to the military. But going forward, it's likely going to fall in this bottom portion of the graph, and that's what people call non-defense discretionary usually. That non-defense discretionary, about 1/3, gets passed along to the states. This number, the sort of total number we're talking about here, is about $215 billion in 2013. And really, when you stop to think about it, that money really helps to create the building blocks for state economies and for vibrant societies. So as you talked about with transportation infrastructure, about 30% of those grants to states go to help maintain roads and bridges. Obviously, we could be doing a lot more, but that's sort of where things stand now. Another quarter goes to education funding, whether it's Title I to low-income areas, whether it's special education. That's about 1/4 of the overall outlook. And then another large slice is housing and community development, whether it's housing for low-income folks or a program known as LIHEAP, Low-Income Heating and Energy Assistance Program. That's really sort of where the bulk of federal dollars to the states flow.
Can I add something quickly?
Sure.
And just to talk about that 28% that goes to transportation, well, what that usually means is that for a given transportation project in the state, actually 80% of the money comes from federal funds and only about 20 comes from the states, somewhere about there. So that small piece of the pie makes a big difference in the state.
And actually, that's a great segue. So just as, I'll pay you later for that.
Good job.
You could be one of our analysts. So just as it's sort of a large part of the federal budget, it's a very meaningful part of the money that New Hampshire spends in any given year. New Hampshire has a 2-year budget cycle, as many of you probably know. We're currently sort of at the midpoint, really. And over the course of that biennium, we have a total budget of around $10.4 billion. 30% of that total comes from federal funds into New Hampshire. So think about what that means. The New Hampshire budget can be sliced and diced in a number of different ways. There are really sort of 6 key categories that policymakers look at. And so federal funds play a different role in each of those categories. In something like health and social services, which handles the Medicaid program, it's obviously a really large part of the overall picture. Close to half of total expenditures derive from federal funds in New Hampshire within health and social services. Within transportation, it's about 1/3 when you look at sort of gas taxes and federal funds. A little bit smaller in education, but again gets much larger when you talk about resource protection, which is really sort of the state's environmental programs. So obviously it plays a key role in financing state and local government here in New Hampshire. And if we need to sort of enact some form of deficit reduction while also trying to pursue the Bush tax cuts, that means additional spending cuts are going to have to occur. And just obviously the details are still pretty vague about what the consequences would be, so just wanted to provide you with one sort of illustration. These numbers were put together by 2 national groups, Citizens for Tax Justice and the National Women's Law Center. And if you think about sort of, as I talked about earlier, the difference in proposals that were put forward in the Senate last week, it's about a $70 billion difference between extending the Bush tax cuts in their totality and limiting them for people below $250,000. $70 billion, excuse me, may not mean much in the abstract, but what they found is that if you take all federal funds for highway planning and construction, all of Title I education, all of Head Start, all school breakfast, all clean water funding, and meals for seniors that flow through to the states, that in itself is $70 billion. So these are just examples of all the things that could be lost. To give you an example of what that might mean for New Hampshire, New Hampshire in 2012 got about $40 million in Title I education that helped provide services to 162,000 school kids across the state. Similarly with Head Start, there was about $15 million in federal funds that accrued to New Hampshire this past federal fiscal year. That's services for 1,600 children. School breakfast, a smaller piece of the overall puzzle, but still very important. You know, it's the sort of thing that makes a real difference in a kid's day, keeps them healthy, gets them in a position to learn and succeed. And because of federal funding, we were able to provide breakfast to about 25,000 school children on average each day here in New Hampshire. So that's just one illustration. And you know, we don't have to sort of think about hypotheticals into the future. As I mentioned, we're already going to have substantial cuts in education as a result of budget deals that were struck recently. And I just want to share with you the results of one survey where school administrators are asked, you know, what are you going to do in response to these sort of budget cuts? How might you cope with them? And the majority of these school administrators, these are national numbers, said that close to 70% said they'd have to reduce professional development in some way, so teachers would not be able to get the skills that they need to do their job. Over half said that they'd have to reduce academic programs, whether after school or enrichment programs during the day. Over half also said they'd have to increase class size and lay off instructional staff. So we're going to see very real consequences from these kind of budget cuts right here at home before we even sort of start talking about extending tax cuts further. Obviously, the focus tonight is on jobs, and so what I wanted to leave you with is, as we think about different approaches to tax policy at the federal level, we should think about sort of how those resources might be used differently. And Mark Zandi, who's a pretty well-known economist, at least in DC, he was an advisor to John McCain, so he's not somebody who necessarily sort of sees eye to eye with the Obama administration. He was asked effectively in testimony, you know, how much bang for your buck do you get for tax cuts versus other approaches? And what he found, Moody's Analytics did these numbers, is that if you take $1 and devote it to extending tax cuts, the next year you're likely to get back 35 cents in additional economic activity. Take that $1 and devote it in other ways, and you get a much larger bang for your buck. His findings were that if you use it to increase infrastructure spending, you get back $1.44 in additional economic activity. If you were to increase, at least temporarily, funding for so-called SNAP or food stamps, it's got an even bigger return, $1.71 on average. That may seem a little bit counterintuitive to some folks, but when you stop and think about it, things like food stamps go right into people's pockets, and what they're going to do is turn around and put food on their table, make sure their kids have enough to eat. That money in turn is going to, you know, go out into the local economy. Tax cuts, particularly those that are sort of skewed towards the top end, are going to end up in people's pockets as well, but they're much more likely to save it, put it aside for a rainy day, than they are to go out and spend it right away.
And let me underline that in a second way for a moment. So 35 cents on the dollar, disproportionately benefiting the wealthy, as opposed to $1.71, and people get to eat. Right. That's a no-brainer.
So happy to take questions during the larger session, but now I'll turn it over to our next speaker, and give me just a second to make the transition here.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff and Krista.
Oops.
So I'm Cynthia Ward from US Action, and today I'm going to talk about Building an America that works with 99%. And this does not mean we're not talking about Building an America that works with 99% and the 1%. We are, but if you sort of noticed recently, they seem to be doing pretty well themselves without much help. So we're going to focus on the 99% where we've been having some struggles. So this is, so we're going to be asking 5 questions for the 99%. 1, why isn't the economy working? How do we what makes the economy work? How do we get our economy moving forward again? What can we do together for our country? And what are we asking our elected officials? So why isn't the economy working? The answer is actually pretty simple. The last 30 years, the rich have raced ahead, and middle class and working families are getting squeezed and crushed. Now, the 400 richest families in America earn more than 150 million Americans. And the taxes on the richest that we just heard were cut in half. So in the same period, their taxes were cut in half. And what did many of the biggest corporations do? They pushed up profits by pushing down wages and benefits and shipping jobs overseas. So corporations are actually sitting on $2 trillion in cash, more than in decades. But instead of creating jobs, what they've been doing is increasing CEO salaries and dividends to shareholders. Corporate taxes are at a historic low in terms of the economy and share of federal revenues. And it's not that the country didn't grow, it did actually quite a bit, but it wasn't shared evenly. We had a skewed amount. And actually, if it was shared evenly, our paychecks would have been up by 60%. So something that we actually probably could have used quite a bit. But instead of that, what happened is we had the rich and corporations lobbying, and then we saw some of the very inequitable tax breaks that we saw with the Bush tax cuts. So why isn't the economy working? For the last 30 years, the rich got richer at the expense of the 99%. And now we're going to look at two examples a little more closely to just get a bit more of an example of what actually has been happening. So remember we said that the richest 400 families own more than 150 million Americans? Well, these three people and their three siblings are actually like the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. They are smiling because they had a very, very, very good last few years. Does anyone know who these people are?
Walmart in the middle, Coach
There
in
we
the right.
go.
I don't know the guy on the left is.
They are all the Walmart siblings. These are the Waltons, the Walmart family. They now are worth $48.8 billion. They're now worth more than 42% of the American population combined. They're worth more than $48.8 billion. So they're the heirs. They've not been involved at all in the company. They inherited this. They own about 40% of the company stock. And in just 3 years, while the country was going through one of the most major economic depressions, their stock went up, rose 22% from $75 billion to $89 billion. At the same time, the wealth of average Americans fell by 39%. So up by 22%, down by almost 40%. But before we talk about how this happened, let's just focus on that $89 billion. How much is $89 billion? If you had $89 billion, you could buy all these sports teams. All the ones in the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, and you would still have money left over for a few soccer teams. So it is like a whale of a lot of money. But do you think the Waltons thought they had enough when they were at the $78 billion? No, they did not. Because they spent millions lobbying to eliminate the estate tax. They felt like they should have to pay absolutely nothing whatsoever. So when all those discussions were going on, they were in there. They and 18 other super rich families were put the bulk of the money to try and eliminate it. But were they putting their faces on the front saying, we stand to gain $39 billion if the estate tax is not taxed? No. Family farmers. Remember all those ads about family farmers, the family farmer who's going to lose their farm? So you may be surprised to learn that actually only 125 farms would even be impacted by the estate tax, countrywide. And when people have been asked to come up with a family farmer who's actually lost their farm to the estate tax, we have never seen one who's actually been brought forward. So the 1%, the super rich and corporations have been spent millions lobbying and in campaign contributions to win back billions that they will then get in preferential tax breaks. So now let's look at how the rich are getting richer by looking at corporations. And I have to say, first of all, there is a mistake. GE did not get $33 billion back in a refund, but they did get $3.3 billion back in a refund. So GE and Bank of America not only paid no taxes in these years when they got huge profits, they got huge whopping refunds. Not as big as that, but still $3.3 billion. That was a typo. Pretty amazing, huh? Did you
Yeah,
know this?
How did they do it? I wanna
We're gonna
figure
get
that
there,
out.
we're gonna get there, okay. So, well, one thing is, so this is, I love this quote. A recent report found that GE employed an aggressive strategy that mixes fierce lobbying for tax breaks and innovative accounting that enables it to concentrate its profits overseas.
Yeah.
So did those tax breaks lead to job creation?
No.
No. Well, they did, but it was overseas. So they slashed the US workforce by 32,000 and they created 12,000 jobs overseas. GE and Bank of America are not alone. Probably most people in this room have paid more taxes than General Electric, Bank of America, Boeing, DuPont, Wells Fargo, Verizon put together.
You're talking about on a percentage basis, am I correct?
No, I'm talking about total dollar, federal tax dollars. They got, in these years, they all got rebates.
In the billions.
In the billions, yes, yes. This is not looking at, this is federal corporate tax versus income tax, not versus their other taxes that they pay, but in terms of the, yes, the big corporate tax rebates. Okay, so, how did this happen? Your question. So, tax holidays. American companies have parked $1.2 trillion in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and other tax havens to avoid paying taxes. They now want to bring that money home, but they don't want to pay taxes on it. So what's in this for the U.S. taxpayers? They say, if we could just bring this money home tax-free, we would create jobs. It'd be a win-win. Sounds like a good situation? Well, we tried this before in 2004. And since then, they have been counting on another tax holiday. They have been stocking away like tenfold as much money as they did before. So should we pass a win-win? Win-win tax holiday? There's one problem. Number one, U.S. companies are already awash in cash. Remember that $2 trillion we mentioned earlier? They're sitting on $2 trillion, which is the higher share on their cash balance sheets than we've seen in half a century. So if they're not investing this money, what makes us think that we need another 1.2 tax-free dollars back? They're going to invest that money in jobs and in hiring. So why are they lobbying so hard to bring this money back? Well, there were a lot of studies done on the 2004 tax holiday, and what it showed is that over 92% of the money that came back went into CEO salaries and stockholder dividends. Now they were prohibited from doing that. It was explicitly written and they were not allowed to do that, but they did it anyway. Virtually none went towards job creation. And when the Congressional Budget Office looked at 11 different possibilities for boosting job creation, the tax holiday was dead last. But what they did do is, if you look at how much money they spent lobbying for the tax holiday and what they got out of it, 22,000% return on their investment. So they came out quite well. All right, so why isn't the economy working? For 30 years, the 1% have gotten richer at the expense of the 99%. Now let's take a look at what makes the economy work. So one thing that we need to remember, if there's one thing, when the American middle class is the engine of the economy. When we all do better when we all do better. Deregulating Wall Street and trickle-down economics for the rich didn't create jobs. It's workers who get decent salaries, who go and shop on Main Street, who want it it's going to go right back out again. And it's going to then be rippled again and again, because then the shop owner is going to go out and spend it on something else. So that's who create jobs. It's really simple. When our economy works better when every American who wants a job is working. This idea isn't new. Henry Ford doubled worker wages from $2.30 an hour to $5 an hour, and it was all around the idea of if workers have got money in their pockets, they'll be able to go and buy what they're making, which is the Model T. So by raising wages, he attracted skilled workers, he reduced costs for training and turnover, and they wanted to produce 60% of the cars in this country. So for 70 years, the American economy worked this way. The middle class and the rich did well together, and even the poor were brought along. We all did better, we all did better. So what would this look like today? Let's go back and look at Walmart. So on average, Walmart associates make $8.81 an hour. And because of their 34 an hour average work week, that's just $15,000 a year. So hundreds of thousands of Walmart associates work full-time, but they're still below the poverty line. And in fact, Walmart has more people, as a company that has the largest number of workers who are on public assistance of any other company, costing the country an average of estimated $1 billion. So what if we raised Walmart's workers' salaries? Wouldn't they then be able to, afford more and buy more? But I hear everyone's voice saying, God, we'd have to lay off workers or we'd have to raise prices. Because that's what we hear from about companies when we talk about raising the minimum wage, right? Well, let's look at some other numbers. While Walmart associates were being paid $8.15 an hour, the CEO was making $9,000 an hour. And that's just the CEO. All the other, executives are making large amounts. And the stockholders got $18 million, $11 billion a year in dividends, which works out to $8,000 per worker at Walmart. And then there, of course, are the Walmart heirs with their $89 billion.
Thought you said before that they only had 48 million because they only control, 48 billion because they only control 40% of the stock. And
No,
the
that's
stock
what-
had gone up to 89 million.
No, that's what they have. That's what they're worth. Yeah, those six are worth that amount. So the nation's largest employers of low-wage workers, which is Walmart, Yum Brands, and McDonald's, all share these features: increasing profits, increasing CEO salaries, and large stockholder dividends. They can afford to increase wages without laying off employees, and they can help the 99% get ahead and get the entire economy moving again. So what makes the economy work? If the 99% gets ahead, the entire economy works. So how do we get the economy working again? A strong middle class, the engine of the economy, is built by the decisions we make together. Middle class didn't prosper by accident. It was decisions that we made together. So one, we need to invest in people. We need to expand opportunity. We need to provide security, world-leading education, affordable health care, protections at work, and retirement security. We were talking just now about student loans. That's a good example of this. Just this year, there was a big fight to try and extend keep the rate down on the Stafford loans. We were successful. We meant that they weren't doubled, and so students didn't have to have another $1,000 of interest on top of their loans. Great victory. So much more needs to be done. I mean, we surveyed our members and asked for stories about student loans, and it's crazy how much people are taking on to themselves to be able to be prepared for the next century workforce. And not only are people deciding not to go to college because it's too expensive and they can't take on those loans, but when they come out, they don't have money for other things like being able to afford a home. So
Yep, we have never defaulted, we've never missed a payment, but we live in a one-bedroom apartment, the three of us. That's what we need to do.
it's crazy how much, how much more people have to pay now than before to be able to go to school. So second thing, the middle class didn't prosper by accident, decisions we made together, decisions that that pave the way for businesses to innovate and meet the future. Example here is the American Jobs Act, where we would have invested $140 billion to put people to work fixing infrastructure and both roads, bridges, and crumbling schools. The ripple effect would have made it, result in about $220 billion of work in this country, putting people back to work. And yet just two small pieces of the American Jobs Act have passed. All the other major pieces are stalled. Third area that we want to look at.
I don't quite get give me an example of innovation besides spending.
So innovation is things that means jump-starting work that makes sense to have happen. So, our bridges and roads were not built by, people didn't decide to do that on their own, and even with the internet, right? It was all things that we said, if we do this together, let's put some capital into making this happen. So
money
green
into
jobs,
research and development.
right. We want companies to do it, but the government can play a role in putting some money out there to encourage more people to do it together.
Could I point out too, as a former state rep who was working on the Labor Committee while we passed the New Hampshire Works bill, that was a statewide program that helped put people back to work, where the state worked with private companies to incent them to hire workers and retrain them and get them back to work. So that's another very good innovative tool that we use right here in the state.
And things like, in California, they raised the standards for, the efficiency standards for refrigerators, and they became like, there was all this work that happened in the state because, you know, they wanted to, because it was a big enough market, and they needed to make new refrigerators in there, and it forced a whole set of new innovations in that state.
One of the New Hampshire examples, I think, is broadband in the northern sector, where, you know, business can't really locate there because they don't have internet access.
Yes, and that would be good, yeah, that's crazy, yep. And the final area, writing rules that boost business to do the right thing. Create good jobs here in America, make safe products, safeguard our food and water. An example here is the Bring Jobs Home Act. Unbelievably, companies now can claim a tax break for moving expenses if they move jobs overseas. So this simple bill would just say, no, I don't think we should be paying for that. And instead of getting a tax break for moving jobs overseas, for moving expenses, it says no longer will do that. And instead, you'll shift the money if people bring jobs home. They can then get refunded for those tax breaks. So this bill came up for vote in the Senate, where the Republicans filibustered it, and it's unlikely to come up in the House this year. So, is this guy's face familiar?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I did it all on my own.
There we go. So there's been this whole sort of discussion about, you know, did we do it on our own? Is it with something that we're working together? Has been on the news a lot. This poor guy has been harassed.
Yeah.
He's getting harassing phone calls under the set. But anyway, I just find it interesting that when we tried to find two companies who would stand up and say how they did it all on their own and had no help, both those companies had not a long history, but they got each got over $1 million in government assistance and loans. So we're not saying it's not individual initiative. It is. I would never want to be a small business owner. Yes, it's an individual initiative and a helping hand from government when needed to make sure that we're making things move fast.
Do you know how much those companies are worth today and how many people they employ?
I have it someplace, but I don't know it offhand. But it's
It would
yeah.
be, it
want to invest in those jobs. So how do we do that? And I think we need to act independently on our own and breaking from the corporate political parties and forming something in the interest of working people.
Have folks heard much about sequestration? And I want to sort of throw it back to sort of what's been happening around sequestration. And tomorrow, Kelly Ayotte, John McCain, and Graham are coming to Merrimack to talk about why the military should be exempt from sequestration and that we shouldn't cut the defense budget. So I want to sort of throw it back to Jeff, if you don't mind, sort of just talking a little bit about what happened after the super committee, what's planned to happen with sequestration, and what we need to do to get to the deal so that sequestration.
Sure. I mean, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that, you know, all along, all of the discussions, you know, in the wake of the debt crisis last year were premised on this deal that would sort of be evenly shared among the various parts of this the federal budget. And, you know, here in New Hampshire, like a lot of places, obviously defense jobs are pretty important, but it is the deal that was struck, and if that deal is undone now, it means that we're going to have to find savings elsewhere in the budget, and, you know, in areas where I talked about before, whether it's education or transportation infrastructure. And I mean, I think obviously there's a lot of expectation that post-election, sort of heading into early next year, there's going to be a pretty large debate about whether to continue on with sequestration or to find some sort of deal to replace it. And I think before you have a deal to replace it, it's premature to begin to unravel the one that's on the table.
You know, when I think about sequestration, I can't help but thinking about the Republicans' hue and cry about the bail-ins. And how is this different? I mean, we want to keep all of these people employed, and the defense industry is very friendly with the Republicans. Do we really need all of that investment in defense? Do I think that we ought to have a rational build down plan as we learn more and more about how to settle arguments other than going out and grabbing a gun and shooting somebody?
I think you said it well. I think you need to have a rational plan in place to sort
Yeah.
of think about what our needs, just like any other part of the budget. What are our needs going to be in the future? Let's plan to those needs rather than just sort of trying to hack and slash our way.
Well, Obama did
There's a-
cut a significant part of it.
Right, and this sequestration
was
was
over on top of
yeah.
it.
Well, there's sort of two parts to the Budget Control Act. There's sort of the initial phase, and then because, as you said, the sort of super committee fell apart, that kicked in another $1 billion.